right, here we are in a video on cynicism, and not the modern cynicism. You may have heard people call you a cynic, and we'll talk about that in the video. Now, this is the video we're really focusing on is on ancient Greek cynicism, founded by a student of Socrates. I'll write his name down. There we go. His name is Antisthenes. 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 Doesn't roll off your tongue. And he was a student of Socrates. Now, Socrates rolls off your tongue, right? Socrates had many famous students. His most famous student, by the way, would have been Plato. I'm sure you're familiar with Plato. Antisthenes and Plato, they went to the school, if you call it a school. Socrates didn't really have a building like a school that you would think of, but he was in the philosophical thought of Socrates in that for around 430 BC. That's Antisthenes. Whereas Plato, he came around 410. So 20 years later, Plato makes his appearance, and there is some suggestion that the two did not get along. Nevertheless, let's look at some things about cynicism. So here's some highlights on it. And again, this is ancient Greek cynicism, not the modern cynicism. So there is an emphasis on virtues, self-sufficiency, living according to nature. But here's where it gets down to it: rejection of material possessions. And we're going to talk very soon about a guy named Diogenes, who was another cynic, and he really had an extreme version of cynicism. And asceticism. Those are the five. And of course, within this, there is this minimalistic idea. And to sum this up, I'll write it over here. It's just you're going to avoid luxury. Avoid luxury and comfort. I mean, that's what asceticism is, really. It's a self-torture in a sense. You reject possessions, and you live this ascetic lifestyle. And the one who took this to the extreme, and probably the most famous cynic, even though he didn't found it, he was a student of Antisthenes. His name is Diogenes. And there's a lot of myths about Diogenes. So he lived an extremely ascetic life. He had no possessions, had no job. Legend has it that he only had a bowl to eat. And then when he saw a boy drinking from his hands, eating from his hands one day, he said, well, I don't need this bowl either, because the bowl was a possession. And so he threw it away. And that's, you see maybe a lot of pictures of that, of Diogenes throwing the bowl away. He didn't want any possessions. And here's that painting of Diogenes throwing the bowl away. So it seems contradictory when you think about self-sufficiency, because the cynics believed in self-sufficiency, and yet here he was begging for his life, begging for his food, that is. And so what the cynics said, that begging and scavenging was a form of self-sufficiency, but to our minds that would not be. To think about our modern view, you may think of cynicism for the ancient Greeks as beggars or hobos, people who reject all possessions. And the only thing they want is things that they need to survive, like food and water. But they do want to, deep inside, besides that, they do want to have these ideals of virtue, of courage and wisdom and justice, just like the Stoics. Now, over time, over centuries, that is, uh, the word cynic would come into the English language, and modern cynicism is completely different. Now, it's again, let's write some of the things of modern cynicism. So, if someone calls you a cynic today, they're not referring to the ancient Greeks. They probably don't even know Diogenes. But a cynic is someone who's highly skeptical. You're highly skeptic. And you're highly skeptical of the motives of people. You think people are in it for their own interest only. So you're highly skeptical. You're pessimistic. You're quick to point out flaws. Quick to point out flaws. You're critical and skeptic. That's a modern cynic. Now, there are some good traits to be skeptical and to point out flaws, but when that's your only modus operandi, and when you assume the worst, it's another thing. You always assume the worst. So there's a pessimism in being cynical. But the main point is that you think that humanity, that their motives are skeptical. They're out for themselves. That's really when you're being cynical, which is a little different than the ancient Greece. So the ancient Greek version. All right, that's our video today.